Hi everybody, my name is Rebecca and I'm going to talk about my paper, Necropolitical Inaction, the Welfare State, the UK Government and the UNCRPD. I'm based at the University of Leeds and this paper forms a small part of my PhD project, which is Personal Independence Payment as Necropolitical Governance, supervised by Dr. Alison Sheldon and Dr. Tom Campbell. My details are in the bottom left-hand corner if anyone wants to contact me at any point. So just to outline this paper, so this will explore the concept of necropolitical inaction. It will be contextualised by the government response to the UNCRPD. Personal Independence Payment, or PIP, will be used as a case study, and quotes from the War on Welfare campaign will also be evidenced. There is a reference list as a Word document link that you can open in the video description, rather than me trying to read out all the references at the end. Okay, so looking at the UK government and the welfare state. How does welfare work? What do we mean by the welfare state? So under capitalism, society operates a work needs-based system. That's Stone, 1984. And this means those who cannot work must pass a validating device or a test is created. Disabled people approach the needs-based system. So they approach the welfare office are viewed with suspicion because it's assumed they're trying to escape the work-based system. And this is because disability is a problematic category because no single condition of disability is universally recognised. So the validating device or test has to be extremely subjective, and it's down to the assessor's opinion of what they think a disability is because it's so diverse. So for example, a benefit that isn't like this is a state pension, because no one can argue, all but subjectively, I don't think you're 65, you're just 65 or over and that's it. So yeah, that's why there is a bit of a problem in the welfare state of how to define disability and why that becomes an issue, as I'll detail with. So disability is seen as what's described as an extra cost. So it's an extra cost benefit. So like PIP's predecessor, disability living allowance and PIP, they are designed to cover the extra cost of living if you belong to a certain group. So if you're a disabled person, you have additional costs, it's recognised you have additional costs and you're given this additional money. Another example is like child benefit. So you have a young child, you're in a special category, you have additional costs, so then you get money, ideally. So on average, disabled adults have £583 of additional cost per month. And these extra costs make up just over half their income, and that includes if they're getting welfare or not, they still have this amount of cost to cover. So the benefits intended to help with these additional costs, even if the recipient is successful, often fail to fully cover those costs because they are based on standardized approximations, which means that everyone gets the same set amount of money, whether you're in the lower bracket of what rate you receive or the higher bracket of what rate you receive. And this means that it doesn't take into the complexities of each disability and what that person needs. This means that disabled people face higher levels of deprivation. That's by Bernard, 2019. Being categorised as eligible to receive welfare support, however, can be the difference between being in poverty or not. That's by Roulstone and Prado, 2012. So looking at the Welfare Reform Act, which is where PIP, the legislation where PIP was created. So the Welfare Reform Act 2012 was an act of Parliament which made changes to the rules of the welfare system, changing several benefits such as universal credit, PIP, work capability assessments, or the under occupancy penalty, also known as the bedroom tax. And this was enacted by the 2010 Lib Dem coalition with the Conservative Party. The way disabled people are perceived at this time influenced the strict nature of disability benefit criteria and the intensification of tighter welfare policies under the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. That's by Wiggan. So going on to the UNCRPD. So the UNCRPD is a convention whose purpose is to elaborate in detail the rights of persons with disabilities and set out a code of implementation for those rights to be fulfilled. Countries that join in the convention engage themselves to develop and carry out laws, policies, and administrative measures for securing the rights recognised in the convention. Under Article 4, they also have to abolish laws, regulations, customs, or practices that constitute discrimination. And there is an optional protocol for disabled people who allege that their rights under the convention have been denied. And it was this protocol that prompted a UN investigation into the UK to see whether they were abusing disabled people's human rights. So going on to the investigation itself. So the UK government became the first country to face a high-level inquiry by the United Nations Committee for violations of the UNCRPD. The committee, important to note, the committee only has the power to launch an inquiry if it receives reliable information that violations have been committed by a country. So it's not just something that happens overnight, it's something where they have to have a lot of reliable information and evidence to be able to carry out an investigation. So the article that was broken that I'm going to focus on today, there were several, is Article 28, the right to an adequate standard of living and social protection. So the rollout of policies like the Welfare Reform Act 2012 included statements by high-ranking officers that reforms were aimed at making the welfare system fairer and reducing benefit fraud. However, the inquiry found that no substantiation of the alleged benefit fraud by disabled people was completely unsubstantiated. And they found that disabled people had regularly been portrayed, not only by government, but by media and so on, as choosing a life of dependency on benefits. And the medical approach was taken to needs assessment, so this places the blame on the individual, also known as the individual model in disability studies. So this places the blame on the individual and does not take into account the needs, views, and history of disabled people where decisions affect them. So this included both in the assessment processes for benefits, but also when the government was creating these policies, they didn't really do an impact assessment on how that might impact certain groups of people. So disabled people weren't consulted when these changes were made. So now I'm going to quickly talk through necropolitics and then go back to the UN investigation and explain why I believe it is necropolitical. The government response. So what is necropolitics? Necropolitics is a theory first attributed to Mbembe in 2008. So necropolitics is a governance of death, and this divides people into three categories: the living, the dead, and the living dead. So the living people at the top, they're fine, you know, living their life, it's okay. The people at the bottom have unfortunately passed away. And what I'm interested in is this middle group, the living dead, because they're merely existing. They live in a society where they don't get to fully live their lives as they want. They're just existing in that world. So this has previously been applied in the first instance to racial genocide, but has also been applied since to define the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community and the discrimination they face. Additionally, it's been applied to necropolitical inaction or the refugee crisis, which I'll talk about next. It's also been applied to femicide in Mexico, in the war on drugs, and also the femicide of Black Lives Matter protesters. Most recently, it's been applied to the experiences of UK asylum seekers and the treatment they face. So today I wish to focus on necropolitical inaction. So necropolitical inaction talks about how the biopolitical control of migrants paves a way forward for necropolitical inaction. So where there is a failure of adequate provisions for people in refugee camps, like the one in Calais, France, the work of the government and the European Union holds all of that power, and in terms of the way they choose to respond to that crisis. So biopolitical control of migrants by keeping them in those makeshift camps is seen as a very technical exercise, where the people aren't really seen as human beings, it's seen as more of a technical bureaucratic exercise to decide what to do with them. So in being identified as a migrant or refugee, this allows the government to neglect them, where, and this is a quote, not so much that life is being sanctioned, life is not so much being governed as death itself is sanctioned, so death is allowed to happen because the government don't do anything about the refugees because they're not really bothered about them. So this returns me to the UNCRPD investigation. I would argue this is not dissimilar to the UK government's reaction to the United Nations report that condemned welfare changes and decided that they had broke the convention. The government's response to the idea that they were conducting human rights abuses of disabled people was an outright rejection of the allegations. They just said, we're not doing this, despite all the evidence collected. So the government, this was taken from their response. So the government engaged fully with the inquiry process. However, we strongly reject the findings and believe the core intentions of the recommendations are already being fulfilled. So their argument is, oh, we haven't broke those protocols because we're still filling the intentions of those protocols. So the government considered many recommendations by the committee, and many of the recommendations promote actions that they already take, such as actively engaging disabled people in policy design and delivery. As a disabled person who was part of a DPO, I can say the government doesn't really do much of that, to be honest. And they accept that some PIP claimants may have individual issues with the assessment process. However, this is a much wider issue, as I'll go on to now. So this is a quote from Teresa Degna, who was at the UK's public examination after this investigation. And this quote reads, "Evidence before us now and in our inquiry procedure as published in our 2016 report reveals that social policies have led to a human catastrophe in your country, totally neglecting the vulnerable situation which people with disabilities find themselves in." So they have all the evidence, they've given all the evidence to the government, and the government does not take action, which is necropolitical in of itself. So very quickly, I am going to talk about disabled people's stories. So there's one here of Helen. Helen talks about how a PIP assessment is closest to breaking her to extend the torture of pushing through the appeals process after being left £450 worse off. And she says that there's a deliberate institutional harm by the government and its lackeys. Going quickly on to the next one. Now my PIP assessment is due for reassessment. I honestly believe that I'm going to be pushed over the edge. The form hasn't arrived yet, but my anxiety is already through the roof. I'm so scared I'm going to be left with nothing. I'll be forced to go to mandatory reconsiderations and appeals. I can't fight anymore. I am weak. Life is even more precious when you attempt suicide, and to have it threatened for the sake of making a profit is sickening to the nth degree. I and all others must be valued, otherwise, how are we to recover? That's by an anonymous person trying to stay alive, 2019. A bit of a longer one here, where Lynn points out that her report from 2016 was so flawed she couldn't believe what they'd put down. She scored 0 for PIP, even though previously she was on a DLA indefinite award. So she notes that assessments are physically and mentally killing people. Today I've gone from wanting to smash everything around me and the urge to take every bit of medication I've got. I know others are going through this process, but how many are hanging on just by a thread? Please, someone make it stop. So that brings me to my conclusion. So in terms of necropolitical inaction, the government response has arguably been a great example. By refusing to take action and reject the findings, the government is allowing disabled people to not continue as they wish and live their lives as they would like, in comparison to having the same standard of living as a non-disabled person, which again is what extra cost benefits are supposed to be for. They are trapped in a welfare system that dehumanises those trying to access funds that they desperately need, and the government must fill its human rights obligations to cease dealing in necropolitical forms of government. Just as a final thought, There's a political cartoon here with Ian Duncan Smith, who oversaw a lot of these reforms, all of them. So it says this was drawn in response to the coronavirus pandemic. But I designed universal credit to call the disabled. How was I to know ordinary people would end up needing it? So what's interesting about this is that before COVID-19, disabled people on extremely low incomes were highlighting that universal credit was not enough to live off. And people were struggling, food bank usage increased, and so on. And then after COVID-19, when loads of people started claiming universal credit and saying, oh, this isn't enough to live off, it's almost like it mattered more because the ordinary, in air quotes, person needed that money, leaving the benefit system overwhelmed. And that's what I'd like to leave you guys with as a final thought.